Good morning, Mike.
Good morning. Nice to see you again, Mayumi-san. Ohayou
Thank
gozaimasu.
you. Ohayou gozaimasu. Last week, when you talk about the Little Tokyo, your great-great-grandparents from mother's side, your grandparents are from your father's side, and the Little Tokyo story and the people, the Japanese early immigrants come to this country, live there, do business there, raise a family. When you talk about those whole thing, the history, like I said, I felt like I was watching black and white movie. It's just so touching, so touching, so touching. Beautiful days, I believe, although I never see it before, but I just, from my imagination, it's such a beautiful days. Now, Mike, since you're the Yonsei boy, your great-great-grandparents and your great-grandparents must be very proud of you, and I can see they're smiling from the
thank you.
sky. And would you please tell us, as a Yonsei, what you are going to do from now on for this Little Tokyo? And I know you have been doing a lot of research, but please tell us your story or what you plan to do.
Sure. I think my role now in Little Tokyo, and I've been involved in Little Tokyo since really the 1980 when I started my job at Merito Savings. And then I'm still a volunteer at the Japanese American National Museum since 1989. But Little Tokyo Historical Society, I'm the president. I think this is my 8th year. So from 2010, I joined. And the Little Tokyo Historical Society is just a remarkable organization. It's a small, all volunteer, nonprofit organization, but we have so many projects. And so the purpose for me personally is to continue to share and educate the history of Little Tokyo, but also the larger Nikkei Shakai, the Japanese American community, because Little Tokyo was a very important center, commercial, religious, and cultural center for the Nikkei community for 100 years. But there were also smaller communities, such as Sawtell on the west side. And right in Sawtell, Japantown, that's the official name now, Sawtell, Japantown. So it's really the 4th Japantown in California: San Francisco, San Jose, Little Tokyo, and Sawtell. But before the war, there were more than 40 Japantowns, and people don't know that. So I would really like to do deeper research on how to get this information out and share it with people, to show that the Japanese immigrated here well over 100 years ago and established deep roots. And those roots were uprooted during World War II, but they were reestablished in different parts of the state or along the West Coast or even across the country. For example, my father's family was in Manzanar, but after the war, they did not return to Boyle Heights. They went directly to Chicago because there was plenty of jobs, very many jobs available to Japanese. So they say there were almost 30,000 Nikkeijin who moved to Chicago right after the camps. And I still have relatives and cousins in Chicago. They stayed, they never returned to California. But there was a large community in Seattle, in Portland, and even in San Diego before the war, but now it's all shifted. It's much smaller. So I would like to, again, the next part of my research phase is to just share all that history about the Japanese Americans, maybe just along the West Coast, and what happened to them, how it evolved, their societies changed, and what happened to all those Japantowns. They disappeared. So we don't want that to happen to Little Tokyo or any of the Japantowns because of gentrification, right? There's so many changes occurring with real estate. And now the small businesses are suffering even more so because of the pandemic, because they had to close, and now they're reopened, and they're still having challenges, very difficult times.
That's right.
So whatever we can do to support them, that is my kind of my mission going forward. But also to just make sure personally within my family that this legacy is shared and passed on. You know, Mayumi-san, my father's father, Toshiyuki Okamura, the poet, he's from Totoriken. So I've been to Totoriken several times, and I see my relatives. And my grandmother, she has an interesting story, but she was married twice. She divorced her first husband in Sacramento.
In those days, it's very unusual.
Very unusual. In, I think, 1924, she divorced her husband.
Wow, very socially advanced lady.
Yes, yes. And she, for whatever reasons, and her husband, her first husband, was a banker. He happened to be,
oh boy.
He worked for a bank. But we're not related. I'm not related to that gentleman. But she decided to leave her two young daughters with their father. And she came to Los Angeles alone. And she took up a room in a boarding house in Little Tokyo. And she went to sewing school. And eventually she met a man who worked at a printing company, Taiheiyo Pacific Printing Company. And they met, and that they got married, and that's my grandfather. So they got married at Union Church, the old Union Church in Little Tokyo. Now it's Union Center for the Arts. But they lived in Boyle Heights, like so many other people who lived in Boyle Heights.
Yes, Okamura-san, that's one place I would like to ask you. It seems to me that you are looking into Boyle Heights, and you're doing a lot of research in Boyle Heights. And what makes it so interesting besides your grandparents who lived there?
Well, one thing is, you know, when I came home to the States after my Japan time, the first job I had, it was at a Japanese bank, and I would take the bus once a week from where I lived to downtown Los Angeles. And when I would travel going home, the bus would take me through Boyle Heights. And my mother, after the war, her family relocated to Boyle Heights, and she graduated from Roosevelt High School, very famous. Many Niseis graduated from Roosevelt back then.
I see.
But the street the bus was on, it would pass by Nichiren Bukyokai, and I was thinking, why is there a Buddhist temple here in Boyle Heights? And then we would pass by a Japanese restaurant called Fuji Restaurant or something like that, but Fuji, I remember that. So then I asked my mom, how come all these Japanese things are in Boyle Heights? And then she told me that there was a large community of Japanese before the war and right after the war, up until maybe the 1970s. And today there's still a small community there. But that's where I became very interested. I wanted to know about this community that disappeared. And then, of course, my father's parents are buried at Evergreen Cemetery. So we would go visit, do ohaka mairi, and on the rear of my grandparents' headstone, is one haiku that my grandfather wrote. And it's a very beautiful haiku. And just kind of in a nutshell, it talks about a couple being married for 40 years and the moon is looking down at them. And it's been translated. So some of his poems have been translated through the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center under the Issei Poetry Project. So there are a number of Issei poets. Their poems have been translated for that project. And my grandfather, his pen name was Boshicho. So everyone knew him as Boshicho, not Toshiyuki. And so on the back of the headstone, it says Toshiyuki Boshicho Okamura. But that poem is very, very beautiful.
Really?
And so when I do Ohaka Mairi, it's very easy for me to find the headstone because the poem is on the back of it, and it's different from everyone else's around there. You know, Mayumi-san, this is kind of this common thread. Little Tokyo, Boyle Heights, my grandfather, and then even my great grandfather on my mother's side, her grandfather, he was a flower farmer. I think carnations, and he created a new carnation called Matsumoto carnation.
Right.
So now I want to research that, and I learned about it through the Fukushima Kenjinkai because my mother's side they're all Fukushima people. So that's another research project I want to do. But yeah, the poetry book, I'm very interested to publish
please.
it.
Yes,
Yeah, and then
share it to people in Japan too.
Well, I have to tell you too that when he died in October 1972, one of his very close friends, a poet friend, Togawa Akira, very well known in Little Tokyo back then, he wrote a nice tribute about my grandfather that was published in the Rafu Shimpo. And the poems, many of his poems are part of that article. So my relatives in Totori Ken and Wakayama Ken, they have that article. So the poems are there, but to get it to a wider audience, I think
you have to put it together
in Japan or here in English, because some of my friends who are poets, young people, they have they've asked me, asked permission to use the translations for their poetry projects.
Okamura-san, I'm sorry to interrupt you. After the station break, can you continue to tell us your story?
I'd be happy to.
ありがとうございます。Okamura-san, since your grandfather published a poem and wrote a lot of poem and haiku, and it is so precious that you as a grandson definitely have to put it together. Doesn't matter those poems or here or there, just get together, publish it, and also print it to Japan. Let the people in you're from Fukushima, right? You're
on my mother's side. My
mother's side ancestor. Where's your father coming from? Or father's side?
My father's side. So Boshicho-san, he is Totori Ken.
Oh yes.
And then his wife, my grandmother, is Wakayama Ken. And on my grandmother's side, they are Shinto priests. So the family, we have a jinja. Yeah, we have a jinja in our family. It's in Wakayama-shi no Kinomoto. So Kinomoto Hachimangu toいう神社があります。It's very, very old. Very old.
Yes, isn't that something? Oh, gee, you must be very proud of your heritage. But like I said, publish your grandfather's poem. I love to read it because there are so many haiku club here in Los Angeles or Orange County. And lately, those are kind of new. But I would like to let people, including myself, to read old one a long time ago, how Japanese people, they came to this country. Their feeling, it's all in the poem, isn't it?
That's
and
correct.
I love to know and I love to share.
Yeah.
So
I will. That will be part of my mission. But also with my grandfather's pen name, Boshicho. So I have been doing shodo for 3 years.
Oh, really?
And because I was at a shodo kai in Waseda. So I did it for one semester. And I enjoyed it, but I have not done it in many, many, many years. And I kind of looked around. I live in Pasadena. So I looked around to find if there was a class besides Little Tokyo. So I've been doing shodo for 3 years. And my sensei says that one day when I become better, at my work, then I should inherit my grandfather's pen name so that the pen name continues, it lives on. And
You
I
are
decided,
great.
yeah,
You are great,
I would love
Okamura-san.
to inherit his name and to pass that feeling. Yeah, but you know, my own son, um, you know, my father's side, my father and his younger brother were born in Boyle Heights, and I always asked him, "Were you born at the Japanese hospital?" And I don't know if your audience has heard about the Japanese hospital, but it was a very famous hospital historically. It was opened in 1929 to serve the Japanese community, not only in Boyle Heights, but Southern California, because the doctors at the time, the Issei doctors, felt the Japanese needed better quality healthcare. Before that, the healthcare was terrible for any people of color. And if you were Asian, you had to find healthcare somehow. And you know, this is right after the pandemic, the Spanish influenza of 1918. So because of that, prompted these Japanese doctors to say, we need to build a modern hospital for the community, for the Japanese. So there were 5 Issei doctors, and they tried to incorporate in the county of Los Angeles to get a license to build this hospital, but they were denied by the county. So they appealed that decision, and they went to the California Supreme Court, and it was denied again. So then it went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1928, and the U.S. Supreme Court agreed with the 5 Issei physicians that they should be allowed to incorporate in the county of Los Angeles. And then the new hospital was built about 6-7 months later, very, very quick, with community funds, community donations. But the story behind this is there was an early civil rights activist, Mr. Sei Fuji.
Yes.
Fuji Sei. He was also the publisher.
Publisher, yes.
Kashu Mainichi, the California
yes.
Daily News. He was the first publisher, and he graduated from USC Law School in 1913. But he could not sit for the California State Bar examination because he was not a naturalized citizen. He could not become a naturalized citizen because of the laws. So along with his classmate, a Caucasian man, Mr. J. Marion Wright, they took this case about the 5 Issei physicians to the California Supreme Court and then the U.S. Supreme Court. And Mr. J. Marion Wright was victorious at the U.S. Supreme Court. So Sei Fuji-san has this very long history connected to the Japanese hospital and to help with the civil rights, the rights of the Issei farmers, the Isseis, who had no rights, no U.S. rights because they were not citizens. So he worked very, very hard on behalf of the Issei people. So this Japanese hospital, in fact, I have a little memorabilia. The Historical Society, we celebrated the 90th anniversary of the Japanese hospital in 2019. That was the day that the hospital was dedicated 90 years earlier. So the Historical Society, we made these little tote bags. So you can see the handle. But the design is of the hospital. It's very simple, but it's Art Deco. And it's the sign of, this is what the hospital looks like. And the building is still in use. It's a nursing care facility. So
is it still there?
It's still there. And now there's a sign that indicates that it's a Los Angeles City Historic Cultural Monument that the Historical Society nominated, and we worked very hard on the application, and now it's a city landmark. but also in Boyle Heights, I was a consultant on a brochure. Let me show this to your audience.
Oh, yes.
And on the back, my name is here somewhere, but I was a consultant. But this,
yes.
in Boyle Heights, here's a map. But you can see there's like a kiosk.
Yes.
See that round thing?
Yes.
There are 15 of those in Boyle Heights along First Street. And there's one called Japanese Boyle Heights kiosk.
Really?
So I was a consultant on that one, and it tells you, it shares a story, the history of the Japanese community in Boyle Heights. And my intention for the Historical Society sometime maybe later this year or early next year is to do a field trip of just to see that kiosk, and also to visit very quickly some of the remnant Bokyokai. So there's Tendikyo is there, Nisho Kosekai, Konko Kyo, Konko Church, and then Nichiren Bokyokai, also Evergreen Cemetery, Rafucho Gakuen, 90-year-old Japanese language school. It's still in operation.
Wow.
And unfortunately, one of the longtime florist shop called Haru Florist, it closed in February. You know, the owners felt that it was almost 70 years and they wanted to retire. But the last Japanese restaurant in Boyle Heights, Otomi-san.
Otomi-san, I like that.
Yes. So it's a wonderful little Japanese restaurant that is owned by Watanabe-san. And if you have a chance, the viewers, please visit Otomi-san on First Street. It's a really, to me, it's like a kake ryori, very delicious food. And it's a very small space. So
I like that.
You might have to wait. But
I like that.
Again, Boyle Heights, not only the Japanese community, but there were, before the World War II, but there were Armenians, Jewish, very large Jewish community, Armenians, African Americans, some Chinese, Russians. So a very diverse community before World War II. And then after the war, things had changed. The Japanese returned to Boyle Heights, not in very large numbers, but then gradually they moved out because now the housing laws changed. In 1952, I think, the California Supreme Court struck down as unconstitutional the California Alien Land Law of 1913 that prohibited Issei from owning property. Way back over 100 years ago, they could not own property in California because of that law. So 1952, it was struck down, and that meant the Niseis could buy anywhere. They could buy a house. But still at that time, there were housing covenants, restrictive housing covenants. So that meant certain neighborhoods, only Caucasian people could live there. No African Americans, no Asian Americans, no Japanese. But, things improved in the 1960s and 70s. So that's when you saw the migration out of Boyle Heights of the Japanese community, and they went to the South Bay, Torrance, Gardena, Monterey Park, Montebello, Pasadena, San Fernando Valley. Right? Some started going to Orange County, which there were only farmers back then, but now there's a large community of Japanese Nikkei in Orange County. Yes. So things improved. And again, for the sake of the children, the Sansei generation, they had an easier life because their parents, the Niseis, worked very hard after they were released from camp and starting life all over again. So as a younger person, I feel it's important to share this knowledge and history of the Japanese American experience with not only the young Nikkei, but for everyone because it's an American.
Especially for people from Japan.
Yeah,
that's very
yes,
important.
Of course, yeah.
Yes, they have
the
to
Japanese,
know the history.
Yes. Now, when I'm in Tokyo, when I visit Tokyo, I always make it a point to go to Yokohama because there's a wonderful museum called in English, Japanese Overseas Migration Museum.
Oh, they depart from Yokohama, huh?
Yes, Minato Mirai.
Yes,
and it's a very interesting museum because it tells a story of when the Japanese left Japan to migrate to America, South America, Canada, all over the world.
Yes.
So there's a long history there too.
Yes. Okamura-san,
yes.
We will go to Little Tokyo and find you and join the tour group, and hopefully you can guide us here and there after September 1st.
I would love to do that. Yes.
I appreciate that so much. Well, Okamura-san, ありがとうございました。During these 2 weeks, such a precious story and heart-touching story. Amazing, amazing. And we definitely, personally would like to meet you. And again, I want to say thank you and hope to see you soon. ありがとうございました。